Have you ever heard about the learning bell curve? Well, even for learning, there is a process that you can actually optimize in order to absorb more, to learn faster. And this is exactly what we're going to talk about in this video using obviously neuroscience and some techniques that you can start applying in order to optimize learning. So let's talk about this. Do you want to be a free supporter of this channel? All you got to do, subscribe to the channel, won't cost you anything, and it's actually going to help YouTube understand that this is a relevant content and it's going to spread to more people. So I truly appreciate if you do that, and let's talk about the learning bell curve. So here we're going to talk about a more traditional format of learning, let's say a 90-minute class, okay? I'm just gonna use this as an example, but you can use the same concept for any type of learning and any length of learning, okay? So we're gonna make this very easy to understand, simple, and we're gonna break it down, let's say a 90-minute learning session. That could be a class, that could be a window of time that you have in your day to learn new concepts, learn new material content, anything. So let's talk about this 90-minute window, okay? The first 15 minutes, we're gonna divide this into pre-learning, during learning, and then post-learning. What you can do in order to, again, like I said in the beginning of the video, absorb more, absorb faster, okay? And make learning actually work in your life, make learning something that is just not content that you consume, but something that will actually stick with you and then you can retrieve and use it. So let's talk about pre-learning. What should you be doing pre-learning before you start learning something? Let's talk about a 15-minute window before you start learning something. Obviously, if you want to absorb more or better, you have to have the adequate sleep. You have to have the proper nutrition, including hydration. You have to have the right environment. Environment plays a big role. I know a lot of times you can't control because you're sitting in a classroom or in a workshop that you cannot control the environment, but just try to be as neat as possible around you, okay? Not too many distractions. If you're sitting on a desk, for example, don't leave a lot of things hanging around, okay? Those objects, the more objects you have around you, the more points of distraction you will have. So the cleaner the environment around you, the easier it is going to be for you to focus and really absorb the material that is being taught. So talking about how this correlates to neuroscience is that we have something in our brain called the DNM, or the default network mode. Essentially, this mode is when we are either resting or not doing something that is, you don't have to actually pay really close attention or focus, right? So during this 15 minutes, which is pre-learning, you're actually changing from the DMN to attention in a subject. And the part of the brain that is responsible for that is the prefrontal cortex. So you're changing from a resting state, the default network mode, to prefrontal cortex focus, okay? So there is an intention happening right here and a chemistry happening inside your brain. And I think it's important for you to understand this because this is exactly what's happening inside your head. Okay, so it's just not sitting and learning. There's a process that happens before or pre-learning, and it's important for you to understand and know this process. Because there's actually neurochemical activations that is going to happen inside your brain that is going to create focus and alertness. There's actually a neurotransmitter inside your brain that is called norepinephrine, which is responsible for alertness, okay? So the brain is sending these signals and these neurotransmitters in order for you to focus. And during this process, dopamine is being released, which helps with sustained focus. So the brain first is trying to create alertness, okay, sending signals and sending these neurotransmitters, and then the brain is going to release dopamine. which is going to help you sustain that focus. Everything is happening. It's perfect. Our brain is the most perfect computer in the world because everything happens in unison, everything happens perfectly. And I think it's interesting, to say the least, for you to understand this, because there is a lot of chemical reactions happening for you to be able to absorb content. So we talked a little bit about what you should be doing prior learning, right? Now, what should you be doing during this learning window? And we talked about a 90-minute window. So 15 minutes is what you do before learning, right? Getting your brain to be alert. During, let's consider this window, the 60-minute window, which in some studies is considered the ideal window for learning. If you do more than this, it's going to be a little bit too much. If you do less than this, not enough. Okay, so ideal. I'm not saying that you can't learn in 15 minutes or in 20, 25 minutes. I'm talking about, again, this traditional format, okay, of learning. A class, a workshop that you are attending. But the same concept applies for any length of learning. I'm just using this as an example. So during learning, the first thing you need to do is intentionality and engagement. What does that mean? You have to be intentional about what you are absorbing, and you have to be engaging. The more you engage with the content, either by writing it down, asking questions, trying to apply the concepts that you're learning in your situation. So that's engagement. Okay, you're just not sitting there waiting for the time to pass. You're actually engaging with the content that is being delivered. So the more you train this, the sustained attention, the more this is going to strengthen your neural pathways, and that is going to create everything that you learn is going to be more ingrained, okay? And I'll explain a little bit how this works a little bit further. During learning, it's important that you start breaking information down. That's why it's so important to write it down and do bullet points, because you have to start breaking down the content into manageable chunks, because that's going to prevent you to overload your working memory. Okay, the working memory is the memory that is responsible for actions, okay, for execution. So the same way that in a computer, if you open too many windows, I think you've seen this before, you open too many windows, you open, too many browsers, and then you open another program here, and then the computer freezes because there's a working memory in the computer called the RAM memory, and it's basically the same thing in our brain. Okay, so if you break it down into manageable chunks, that is going to help you reduce the risk of overloading your working memory. Hydration during learning is extremely important, because even mild dehydration will affect your prefrontal cortex, which is responsible to keep you interested, keep you alert. Okay, so dehydration will play a big factor in losing focus. Active learning during your learning session, by summarizing, by actually teaching others. That's another great way to retain information. I know that you cannot do that during learning, but I think it's worth mentioning that you can do this to retain information. And we're going to link this into what you need to do after this 60-minute window or the during phase of learning. Then you're going to follow to a 15-minute session that is going to be a winding down. Okay, so you're winding down. You hit a peak. Remember that we were talking about the bell curve, right? A learning bell curve, which goes a little bit like this, right? You started in the beginning with the initiation or the engaging phase, okay, preparing your brain for learning, and then you hit this bell that is going to be like this. There's a peak, and then there's going to be a down slope. So when you start going to this downslope, you start going to the exit phase of this bell, which is going to be the winding down, right? What should you be doing after? Let's say that during 15 minutes after you completed your learning session. Rest. It's important to rest after a learning session. You just overloaded your brain with information. The best way to consolidate that information, to solidify that information inside your brain, is rest. Either a quick nap, I know that's not ideal for everyone, but you could use a technique called non-sleep deep rest. And you can go to Google and you're going to find information about that. I even posted a video about non-sleep deep rest, which is essentially a rest, almost like meditation, right? You're not sleeping, but you're resting. And that helps your brain to consolidate that information and make it stick. And it's interesting because when we try to correlate our brain with a computer, it's so perfect because when you just had a learning session and you're trying to retain that information, resting helps because that information is right now located in the hippocampus. Okay, it's a part of the brain. But to retain for a longer period, that information needs to be sent to the neocortex, another part of the brain, obviously. And resting helps that information to be moved from the hippocampus to the neocortex for longer retention. I think it's fascinating to understand how our brain works and correlate that with a machine. Also, what you can do in the after phase is revisiting the topics that you learned. Go back to the notes that you made, to the bullet points, and revisit. The more you revisit after a session, the more your neural pathways are going to be designed through neuroplasticity to retrieve that information, which just shows us, in my opinion, that the brain is the perfect machine that no man can even compare. We talk about artificial intelligence, we talk about all of that stuff, but the more I study the brain, the more I truly understand that none of this technology can replace the capacity of our brain. One thing that I always tell to people that that helps with learning is exercising. Yes, exercising actually helps with the learning and retention process, because actually exercising enhances the brain-derived neurotrophic factors. You can Google that after, but that essentially helps with neuroplasticity, which is the ability of the brain to modify itself according to what you learn, what you experience, what you feel. So I think that's extremely valuable information. And make sure that you have a good sleeping cycle, sleeping routine, because during the sleeping phase, something that happens, not a lot of people know this, but there is something crucial that happens during your sleep phase. Sleep activates the glymphatic system. What is the glymphatic system? Essentially is a part of the brain that dumps unnecessary information, that does the recycling of data, right? So the brain is going to clean itself, all the data. So the brain is going to actually recycle unnecessary information, and that happens during sleep. And just to reinforce the importance of rest and sleep after a learning session is that up to 40% of information that you learn is lost if you don't rest. Up to 40%. So if you don't have the adequate rest or adequate sleep, if you are in a learning phase of your life, or if you're doing courses or workshops, anything, you lose up to 40% of the retention of that information learned. So if you don't have adequate sleep, you're wasting that information. I think it's interesting to also understand the function. I mentioned earlier about hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, right? Why is it important to understand this? Because the hippocampus is like the Google in our brain. And the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, they work together to recall information. The hippocampus looks and searches for information that is explicit, like facts, any related information to what you're learning, those type of things. And the prefrontal cortex is more strategic. So it looks for specific information. So that's why it's important to understand the correlation between the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, how they work together. So prefrontal cortex is actually going to be more specific about recalling information that was moved to hippocampus. Just to give you context, when you're trying to remember something and you say to yourself, let me think about this, or let me try to remember this, automatically the prefrontal cortex is going to be activated, fishing information or bringing information from the hippocampus. So it's more a strategic way of working. And some people ask me, how about those memories that are related to emotion, right? Because we know that the more emotion that you have in a memory, the easier it is for you to remember, right? When you create that emotion. So the amygdala, not this one, the one that is inside the brain, is responsible for attaching emotions to memories so you can retrieve it in a faster, in a better way. So the amygdala will actually tag information with emotional significance, okay? That's why the more emotional significance an information has, the easier it is to remember. And another great way to retain information is connecting the information learned with personal experiences. This is going to be a great way for you to create neural pathways that is going to make it easier for you to remember. So attaching anything that you learn with personal experience. I do that when I read books, for example. When I read books, I read the information, I make notes, usually on my phone. I have a big, Google Note section that I put every book that I read, and then I make notes and how to apply in my life. So that creates a more neural synapses that is going to make it easier for me to remember that content and then retrieve the content. Because it's not just about learning, it's about remembering that content to be used in your life, right? So learning the content, retaining the content, and retrieving that content in order to use it. So just closing this loop of learning, we talked about the learning bell curve, right? But neuroscience proves that learning is not linear, okay? It's not so straight. There are phases of learning, and it's important for you to understand. These techniques that I suggested in this video, in my opinion, it's a great framework for sustained information retention, okay? Remember, it's not about learning, reading, just consuming content. It's about, number one, retaining that content. Obviously, learning comes first, but retaining the content and retrieving that content whenever you need it, okay? This happens, I think, with everybody, and it happened to me a lot, and still happens, to be honest. But how many times that you watched a movie or you read a book, and then you're like, I don't remember what that movie is about or what that book is about, or I don't remember like the core things about that movie or that book, because that information it's still in your brain, but it's lost because there was no retention, and you didn't work on retrieval of that information, okay? So maybe that information didn't mean a lot to you. Maybe that information was even dumped by your brain. But the most important thing is for you to understand the phases of learning, that when you want to apply this to a content that you want to retain and retrieve, that is important to you, either for work or for personal use, you know what to do. You know how to do this, respecting the phases of learning. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope this video is not just another video that you watch and then you dump it. I hope you retain this information and you use it. By understanding how your brain works, it's going to help you learn faster, learn better, and retain more information and use that information. Just think about that. Hope you have a blessed and amazing day. I'll see you on our next video.